Well, last couple of lectures here, particularly the last one, was all stuff pretty much in chapter one of your book. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to kind of jump a little bit out of sequence here and say some things that kind of relate to chapter one, chapter two, and kind of to a little bit later chapters. I want to explain a couple things here, expand on some of what the book has to say, and that's about planets. Because if you go out at night and you look in the sky, you see stars. You go out tomorrow night and you see pretty much the same stars. Go out the next night, see the same stars. Now the sky shifts a little bit every day, but if you wait a year, you see the same stars in the same spots in the sky, more or less. It turns out that a few of those stars actually look like they wander around. They don't stay in the same spot. And so to the ancient Greeks, they called those wandering stars, or planetes aster. That means wandering star. Okay, because all those other stars, Orion looks like Orion all the time. The Big Dipper looks like the Big Dipper. Those stars, stay relative to each other in the same spot, at least throughout human life. We find in the other half of the class, the stars and galaxies class, that they do move around some, but they move around so slowly that generally for your entire life, you don't see any difference. So a planet comes from the Greek for these wandering things. You go out and you look up there, and a constellation has this bright star in it, and then you go out the next month, and that bright star is in a different constellation. It turns out that bright star might be the planet Mars. Okay, Jupiter moves a constellation every year. In fact, interesting footnote to that is that Jupiter go through about 12 constellations in 12 years. And so if you look at the Chinese calendar, that happens the year of the rat, the year of the horse, the year of the monkey, etc. That happens to be the Chinese constellation that Jupiter is in that year. So Jupiter is tied into the Chinese calendar. Mars moves about a constellation a month. Saturn takes 29 and a half years to go through 12 constellations, so it spends about 2.5 years in each constellation. Again, this is a star pattern there, and that's Jupiter right there. You notice that that's Jupiter a couple months later. It's moved a little bit between the two, and so that's a wandering star. In the ancient world, they looked up and they saw 5 wandering stars in the sky. Mercury and Venus always wandered close to the sun. Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn wandered around the entire sky. Sometimes they were near the sun in the sky, sometimes they were opposite the sun in the sky. You would see Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn at night sometimes. You don't normally see Mercury and Venus except right after sunset or right before sunrise. Okay, so that's 5 planets. Why is Earth not on the list? Well, you don't see Earth up in the sky. Well, duh. Okay, we're standing on it. So these are the 5 things. Why is Uranus and Neptune and so forth not on the list? They're too dim to be seen with the naked eye. Well, there's an interesting thing here. What else can you think of that you see up in the sky at night, but sometimes it's in one part of the sky, sometimes in a different part of the sky, and it changes? That's the moon. So to the ancient world, they thought the moon is a particularly big, bright, and weird planet, weird wanderer. In fact, the word star simply meant anything in the sky. Now, what else do you know besides the moon is up in the sky, and it follows a nice regular pattern. It's sometimes high in the sky, sometimes low in the sky, rise to the east, sets in the west, sometimes rise in the northeast in the summer, rise in the southeast in the wintertime. What would that be? The sun. Okay, so now how many planets does that make? Because the ancients actually saw the sun as a planet. Well, that's 7 planets. Now, what can you think of also that comes in a group of 7? That's the days of the week. We have the sun's day. We have the moon's day. We have Saturn's day. Okay. In fact, if you know Spanish, yeah, yeah. I mean, it's the moon's day. Okay. And Mars's day. Okay. In French, Mars's day is Mardi. Okay. Mardi Gras occurs on Tuesday because Mars's day is Tuesday. Okay. Mercury's day is Wednesday. Jupiter's day is Thursday. Venus's day is Friday. English is weird. It turns out we borrowed some things from one language and some things from a different language to get the days of the week. Okay, but literally this is kind of what these were all named for. I've actually got a handout posted on Blackboard that gives the days of the week and which planet they're associated with. I actually thought this was kind of a cool thing here when I first heard about this many years ago, because you don't normally think about it that just using the calendar, you're actually using astronomy, though you sometimes don't realize that. So we have those planets. Okay. Interestingly enough, by the time we got to the 1600s, they started to realize that Earth went around the sun, and that Earth goes around the sun. All the planets go around the sun, so they realized the Earth was also a planet, and planet was not just a wandering star. That's when they took Jupiter, that's when they took the moon and the sun off the list of planets. You know, though they sometimes continued leaving the moon on the list. And then they discovered moons around Jupiter, and they first called those planets, and they took them off the list. So that was kind of the idea there. They said if it goes around the sun, it's a planet. If it goes around another planet, it's a moon. 1781, a fellow named William Herschel comes along. William Herschel was actually a musician by trade. But he and his sister Carolyn were amateur astronomers. So he built his own telescope, and in the sky he saw this very small kind of bluish green fuzzy dot, and it looked like kind of like a fuzzy star. Well, what he realized was that when he got a little bit better telescope, it was kind of round, like a planet, sort of. And he just couldn't figure out what it was, but he did notice that on different weeks and months, it moved in the sky a little bit, and it moved like a planet, so he realized he discovered a planet. Now, up until that point, the only planets that had ever been known were Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. They later figured out that Earth was a planet because it also goes around the sun. William Herschel discovered something else going around the sun, so it's a planet. So if you discovered a planet, what would you name this planet? The next one out beyond Saturn. And he decides to name it, and he couldn't figure out what to name it, so he says, wait, the King of England is George III. So he named the planet George after the King of England. Okay. So Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, George. Now, the name did not stick because, you know, the professional astronomer said you're not going to name it George because all the others named after Roman gods. We got to name it a Roman god. So Saturn was Jupiter's father, so Uranus was Saturn's father, so that's what we're going to name the thing. And but he kept calling it George. The king kept calling it George, and actually took this musician who didn't really make a whole lot of money as a musician and hired him to be the royal astronomer to the king, paid him a big salary, built him a big observatory, so whenever the king wanted to, he could go out to the observatory and William Herschel could show him the planet George. And so he became a famous astronomer that way. Okay. And then what happened was a fellow named Giuseppe Piazzi discovered a little speck that was orbiting between Mars and Jupiter. So he named it Ceres, the goddess of the harvest. So the solar system, Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Ceres, Jupiter, Saturn, and then George, or Uranus as it was officially called. Well, over the next few years, they discovered that it wasn't just Ceres, but there was also Pallas, Juno, and Vesta in there. So the solar system was Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Ceres, Pallas, Juno, Vesta, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus. Well, quickly astronomers realized that these things were tiny little things, not worth being on the list, and they dropped them off the list of planets. You know, a lot of people were upset when Pluto got off the list, but Pluto was not the first one kicked off the list. These were first kicked off the list. And so they were kicked off the list, so the solar system became Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus. Okay. Then they discovered another planet. A fellow by the name of Urbain Le Verrier, a Frenchman, and British mathematician John Couch Adams, both independently calculated where to look, and Heinrich de Rest and Willem de Gaulle looked at that spot, and they actually found a little bluish dot that was moving around. The little bluish dot they realized was a planet, and so they found another planet. So the solar system became Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. And that kind of brings it up to all these major planets right there. Okay.